The sound of rain pounded relentlessly against the window pane, drowning out every repressed whisper lingering in the living room. Beneath the flickering, golden lamp, two bodies were tangled tightly together on the old sofa, their shadows etched sharply onto the wall, bare skin pressed against bare skin, breath coming in quick, trembling gasps, suspended on the razor's edge between reason and instinct. Ethan clutched Sophie's bare shoulders, his hands trembling in that final moment before self-control dissolved completely. Her thin t-shirt clung to her back, soaked and icy from the dash through the rain, yet the skin beneath radiated a feverish, desperate heat, every inch of her body brimming with longing. We can't do this." Ethan's voice was hoarse, his lips still trailing softly along the line of her jaw, even as the words escaped, laced with hopelessness. Sophie's eyes blurred with tears, though neither of them could tell whether it was the rain or her own heartbreak. "Tomorrow, Julia will know everything. I can't hide it anymore." All Ethan could do was let out a broken groan. He pulled Sophie closer, his mouth trailing hungrily down her neck, arms locking her shivering body tightly to his as thunder crashed and rolled outside, shaking the world beyond the window. Lightning split the room with a harsh, white flash, and in that instant, the red light of the security camera in the far corner began to blink, capturing every furtive movement, every strangled breath, every trembling touch, every desperate, hopeless gaze. That night, everything had gone too far, too intense, too wrong, and far, far too late to turn back. No one knew why Sophie Miller, the bride's younger sister, remained in the house on the eve of the wedding. No one wondered why Ethan Carter, the man about to marry Julia, was the only one awake and wandering the living room in the middle of a rain-soaked night. And neither of them could truly say when these feelings had started to twist into something so forbidden. But when morning came, there would be no secret left to hide. The very last afternoon before Julia Miller's wedding arrived, heavy with dense gray clouds, as damp river winds swept across the row of suburban houses, casting a faint veil of melancholy over the lush green lawns. The Miller family home seemed strangely unfamiliar that day, still those white-framed windows with their blue trims, still the summer flowers lining the steps. But inside, every sound was tinged with the sense that something was about to end, or perhaps about to begin. Sophie Miller had come home early in the morning, carrying a small suitcase, her bridesmaid's dress, and an old journal always tucked away in the corner of her bag. A childish talisman she'd kept since her school days. Her face bore a trace of excitement, yet deep in her eyes lingered a restlessness she could not name. She was always the youngest, rarely the center of attention during family celebrations, even less so allowed to truly show her emotions. Especially in front of her older sister, Julia, the perfect, radiant woman who seemed to outshine everyone around her. That morning, the house was filled with laughter and chatter from relatives and friends. The last invitations were sent, wedding bouquets delivered, dresses laid out across Julia's bedroom. But as the sun dipped lower, guests trickled away, until only Julia, Sophie, and Ethan Carter remained, Julia's fiancé, the man who had been the secret subject of so many of Sophie's daydreams and her quiet pain for years. Their mother had hurried off to town to handle family business, leaving behind a peculiar silence among the three near strangers forced to face each other as darkness slowly wrapped around the house. Ethan returned home earlier than planned, his shirt still drenched with rain, hair tousled from the wind, his tall frame seeming to fill the small entryway the moment he stepped inside. He offered a gentle smile, his eyes flitting across Sophie so quickly yet leaving her flushed with a sudden rush of heat, a mix of nervousness and embarrassment. His greeting was simple, but Sophie's heart pounded violently. A rhythm she thought she'd forgotten ever since that fateful day years ago when he'd first crossed this threshold, still a struggling student, warm-eyed and full of ambition. Julia always knew how to fill every void. She came down the stairs smiling, told Sophie to fetch a towel for Ethan, patting her shoulder, asking after little details. The three of them sat together in the living room as the rain outside thickened, gusts shaking the window and making the sheer white curtains flutter constantly. Ethan took the towel from Sophie's hand. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting moment, enough for a jolt of electricity to shoot up her spine. She instantly drew back, hiding her eyes behind a clumsy smile, not daring to look directly into those deep brown eyes she had once loved so desperately. The afternoon dragged on at a slow, deliberate pace. Julia was busy with the last wedding details, dashing between her bedroom and the kitchen, sometimes stopping to hug her little sister from behind or whisper grateful words in Sophie's ear. Every time, Sophie felt her throat tighten, not from emotion, but from a vague, creeping guilt she couldn't shake, growing stronger ever since Ethan appeared. Ethan sat in a corner of the living room, checking the wedding playlist on his phone, glancing at Sophie in the reflection of the wall mirror. Their eyes would meet, only to quickly dart away, like two conspirators harboring a forbidden secret neither dared to name. Occasionally, when Julia left the room, the air grew heavier. Every question, every answer felt awkward, layered with meaning that only the two of them understood. The rain intensified outside. When night finally settled, the power in the house flickered, leaving only a small table lamp casting a faint, warm glow over the dining table. Julia, exhausted from the long day, excused herself and went upstairs to rest, leaving the two of them facing each other in the big room, with only the rain and the ticking clock for company. Sophie poured Ethan a glass of wine, her hands trembling lightly as their glasses clinked, as if any contact at all could shatter everything. That night's dinner, it was just the two of them facing each other under the pale light, the warmth of food mingling with the scent of red wine, creating a space that felt both intimate and stifling. Ethan took a small sip, then spoke in that deep, gentle voice Sophie remembered so well. "Tomorrow, everything will change. I'm a little scared, too." Sophie laughed, hiding her sense of isolation. "Who is? I bet Julia's more nervous than you." Ethan pressed his lips together, a faint, bittersweet smile crossing his sharp features. His eyes seemed to hold too many things unsaid. "I just hope everything turns out the way Julia wants. She deserves it all." Sophie lowered her head, hands clasped tightly under the table, a strange lump in her throat. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to run away or to shout out loud that she had once loved, and maybe still loved, this man, even though she knew it was something that could never be allowed. After dinner, Sophie cleaned the dishes in the small kitchen while Ethan stepped out onto the porch, absent-mindedly rolling a cigarette though he'd long since quit. Outside, the night was torn by flashes of lightning, the smell of wet grass blending with the sound of rain, making a quiet, aching soundtrack. Sophie leaned against the fridge, watching Ethan's broad back through the glass door, wondering what might happen if the wedding never took place, if all barriers suddenly vanished. Would she be brave enough to speak her truth? The house settled into silence. Julia slept deeply upstairs, leaving Sophie and Ethan sitting close together on the living room sofa, sharing a thin blanket against the cold seeping in through an open window. They didn't say a word, just sat quietly listening to the rain. But that silence held so much more than any conversation could: anticipation, regret, a yearning that had been suppressed for far too long. Sophie looked down at her hands resting in her lap, fingers twisting the edge of the blanket, trying to breathe steadily. Ethan stared out into the darkness beyond the glass, but Sophie knew he was listening to every breath she took, every slight movement. Whenever she shifted, he'd automatically glance over, as if an invisible thread pulled taut between them, waiting for one careless moment to snap. The air between them grew heavier still. The wind slammed the window into the wall, making the lamp shade tremble. Ethan finally turned to look at Sophie, his eyes suddenly shining in the darkness. "Sophie, do you remember that summer? When you turned 17? Sophie lifted her head, heart pounding as old memories flooded back, vivid as a film on rewind. That was the last summer before Ethan proposed to Julia, when Sophie was just a girl, first learning what it meant to love and to lose. "I remember," Sophie whispered, her voice husky, not daring to meet his eyes. "It was the best summer of my life." Ethan smiled, a smile both sweet and unbearably sad. He reached out to take Sophie's cold hand in his palm warm and strong, a single anchor in the silent room. "If tonight there's only the two of us," he said softly, "would you regret it?" Sophie didn't answer, just squeezed his hand tighter. Outside, the rain kept falling, erasing all reason, leaving only the sound of two aching hearts, echoing through the distance between them. The living room was bathed in dim golden light, their shadows overlapping on the wall, their hands intertwined, unwilling to let go. Somewhere up near the ceiling, the tiny red light of the security camera blinked silently, witnessing the fragility of a moment both knew. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the storm still cloaked the sky, thunder and lightning stitching together a soundtrack of anxiety and unrest. Inside the small house, everything seemed to soften in a hush, broken only by the dim glow of the table lamp, bathing the space in a muted golden warmth. On the old sofa, Ethan and Sophie still sat beside each other, and yet now there was no barrier between their skin, their breaths already woven into one from the moment their hands first clasped tightly. Sophie could not remember which of them leaned in first, only that Ethan's lips were suddenly so close, impossibly close, and as the scent of red wine mingled with the wetness of her hair, she found herself powerless to pull away. Their first kiss exploded between them, not gentle or tentative, but fierce and consuming, as if every feeling suppressed over the years had flooded back all at once. Ethan's hand slid to the nape of Sophie's neck, his breath hot against her skin, his mouth desperate and wild, wanting to devour every denial, every fear, every old wound that had stretched through all those silent years. Sophie's thin t-shirt slipped quickly from her shoulder, falling to the floor with a gasp. Ethan's hand glided lightly over her damp skin, fingers tracing the curve of her spine, pausing at her slender waist, making her shiver with a mix of pleasure and apprehension. "Ethan," Sophie whispered, eyes wide in disbelief at what was unfolding, but he only answered her with a long kiss pressed to her collarbone, then murmured, "Just for one night, Sophie, just tonight, let me be weak, let me be real." She surrendered, letting herself fall into his arms as if it were the last time she would ever truly belong to herself. their bodies intertwined in flickering strips of light cast by the ceiling, rain hammering at the windows, heat and breath tangled over every inch of bare skin. Ethan gently lifted Sophie, laying her back on the sofa, his kisses tracing down her neck, over her shoulders, pausing at the trembling swell of her chest. Each touch felt like a sweet, searing burn, etching itself into her memory, forcing her to bite her lip so as not to cry out. Outside, the wind howled at the glass, a warning from conscience itself, but inside, all logic had been defeated. Sophie clung to him, bare legs winding around Ethan's waist, fingers digging into his strong shoulders, pulling him closer, needing more. Ethan whispered something, voice fractured by guilt and pleasure. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I won't regret this. Not if I get to be with you, even just once." There was the rustle of fabric, Ethan's jeans slipping down his hips, revealing skin that had long belonged to no one but Julia. But tonight, in the shelter of the rain, every line was erased. Sophie began to cry, tears blending with the raindrops still clinging to her cheeks, lips pressed tightly together to hold in the sob that trembled in her throat. Ethan bent down, kissing away each tear, his large hands cradling her face, stroking every contour, whispering apologies mixed with declarations of love he'd never dared to say aloud. Together they dissolved into pleasure and tears, the pain of guilt mingling with the sweetness of first, and perhaps last, love. Every movement was silently recorded by the security camera, its small red light blinking in the corner, capturing every gesture, every sigh, every desperate embrace, every gaze drowned in the labyrinth of desire and remorse. The night dragged on slowly, every moment stretched into eternity. When it was finally over, Sophie curled herself into Ethan's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to his pounding heartbeat merge with the rain outside. Neither spoke, neither knew what to say. Neither wanted to let go of this moment, even though both of them were terrified of what daylight might bring. Upstairs, Julia slept on, completely unaware that on the last night before her wedding, the two people she loved most had shattered every boundary of loyalty and trust. Outside, the storm still raged across the sky, but inside the small living room, everything was quiet. Only the sound of breathing, wild heartbeats, and the cold light of the camera patiently waiting for the moment when all secrets would be revealed. Sophie closed her eyes, reaching for Ethan's hand in the darkness, unwilling to wake, unwilling to leave the feeling of being wholly, truly loved, even if just for a moment. She knew nothing would ever be the same, but at least, on that rainy night, she had lived honestly with her own heart. Ethan stroked Sophie's hair, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. He said nothing, just held her tightly, as if he could shield all that was beautiful from being swept away by the storm outside. They lay together for a long time until the rain faded, and beyond the window, the faint light of dawn began to slip through the curtain, announcing a new day. A day when every secret would finally have nowhere left to hide. Dawn crept in quietly, the first rays of light slipping through the white curtains, falling softly onto Sophie's skin, still warm from another body. She awoke in Ethan's arms, the scent of him lingering on every inch of her flesh, the evidence of a night she could never forget still marked across her body. Her head was dizzy, her heart tangled in waves of pleasure and guilt, and all she wanted was to stay still, to bury her face in his chest, to pretend it had all been some reckless dream, unreal. But reality always finds a way to pull us back, with little aches and a nameless, rising dread. Ethan was awake too, lying motionless, staring at the ceiling, his face drawn tight, lips pressed together as if a single word would shatter the fragile world they'd woven through the night. No one spoke. Outside, the early song of birds mixed with the last drops of rain on the roof tiles, creating a haze between fleeting happiness and the endless ache of uncertainty. Sophie pulled the thin blanket over her body, carefully sitting up with her back to Ethan, hiding her red-rimmed eyes. She gathered every piece of clothing scattered around the sofa, hands trembling as she tried to erase every trace of a sinful night. The pale light revealed fresh marks on her shoulder, on her chest, reminders that made her burn with both shame and fear for the future threatening to crash down at any moment. Ethan got up, picked up his shirt, and put it on in silence, his shoulders hunched as if he carried the full weight of guilt on his back. He stepped to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden, searching for calm among the dew-streaked flowers, but everything was covered by a gray fog that clouded his mind. Every breath was heavy, stretching out endlessly. Sophie hurried into the bathroom, standing under a stream of cold water that still couldn't wash away the guilt clinging to her skin. She cried silently, tears mixing with the icy flow, cleansing her fear but not easing any of the pain. When she looked in the mirror, she saw only a tired face, hollow eyes of someone who'd lost everything, her pride, her innocence, and the future she thought she deserved. Ethan sat silently on the chair, hands clasped, his back curved as if he'd aged years in a single night. He tried to think of some reasonable explanation for Julia in case she noticed anything amiss. Every little noise in the house made his heart leap. He replayed the night before, every whispered word, every tear, every hesitant bite Sophie left on his shoulder, the memory both sweet and as sharp as a knife. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Julia woke up, hair tousled, her face carrying the peace of a bride about to begin her special day. She called out as she descended, "Sophie, where are you? Ethan, have you had breakfast?" Her voice was clear, innocent, blissfully unaware of what had unfolded under her roof during the stormy night. Sophie quickly wiped her face, trying to put on a normal front, and left the bathroom with a forced smile. "I'm here, sis. I got up early to tidy up the kitchen a bit." Ethan also stood up, straightening his collar, forcing the most natural smile he could manage. Both avoided each other's eyes, each drowning in their own world of confusion and regret. Julia pulled Sophie close, studying her. "Did you sleep well? I was so tired last night I slept straight through." Then she turned to Ethan, teasing, "You didn't bother my little sister, did you?" The offhand joke was like a small blade, freezing both Ethan and Sophie for an instant before they managed a semblance of normalcy. "No, I slept like a log," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. Breakfast passed in a strained silence. Julia chatted about sweet dreams, makeup plans, friends who would come to celebrate. Sophie helped clean up, but every time Julia turned her back, she'd steal anxious glances at Ethan, fear in her eyes as if the tiniest slip would shatter every secret. When Julia went upstairs to change, Sophie busied herself washing dishes, but her shaking hands dropped a glass, which shattered with a loud, sharp crack in the kitchen. Julia rushed down, fussing over her, while Ethan hurried to help pick up the shards. Their eyes met, both seeing the same fear in the other's gaze. The fear of being discovered, of losing everything, of not being strong enough to face the consequences. At that moment, Julia's phone chimed, a notification blinking on the screen. "Security system motion detected at night." Julia laughed, probably some stray cats in the shed again. She opened the camera app, going through the familiar motions, not noticing the panic in Sophie and Ethan's eyes. The screen flickered, showing the living room in last night's dim golden light. There, the two of them tangled together, every embrace, every kiss, every fevered movement caught on video without missing a second. Julia froze, the phone dropping onto the table, her eyes wide, lips trembling. Sophie stood motionless, hands slack, the water from the dishes chilling her fingers until she couldn't feel them anymore. Ethan stood like a statue, face pale as death. In the small kitchen, only the television from the living room, the ticking of the clock, and the pounding hearts of three people about to break apart filled the silence. Julia bent down, picked up her phone with shaking hands, and watched the footage again. Her eyes glued to the screen, each stolen moment cutting into her heart like a blade. Tears streamed uncontrollably as she looked up at Sophie, the little sister she'd loved, protected, trusted above all, and then at Ethan, the man she was about to call her husband. Sophie burst into tears, collapsing to the floor, her voice trembling. "Julia, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Ethan silently bowed his head, hands gripping the edge of the chair, unable to look up at Julia. No one could speak another word. In that moment, everything fell apart, every illusion shattering like the broken glass on the cold kitchen floor. Julia stepped back, closed the camera app, and collapsed onto a chair, her empty eyes staring out the window. The silence was suffocating. The rain had just stopped outside, leaving drops clinging to the glass, just like the tears none of them could yet let fall. No one knew where to begin, what to say to salvage what had just been destroyed. Julia quietly stood and climbed the stairs on trembling legs, leaving Sophie and Ethan drowning in regret, remorse, and a fear deeper than any punishment could bring. A morning that began like any other, but now none of them were the same. Every secret had been stripped bare, every boundary erased, leaving only shattered hearts and a wound that would never truly heal. The atmosphere inside the house was heavy, as if the storm outside had not yet passed. After Julia quietly retreated upstairs, every sound seemed to vanish, swallowed by the silence. Only the ticking of the wall clock echoed through the spacious, now colder than ever space. Sophie collapsed on the kitchen floor, her hands covering her face, her whole body trembling, sobs choking in her throat but never making it out. Ethan stood frozen by the window, a dazed look in his eyes, his hand shaking as he clung to the edge of the table like it was his last lifeline. For a moment, he wanted to shatter the silence, to run after Julia, to help Sophie up, to shout apologies to the two most important women in his life. But his throat was blocked, and he couldn't force out a single word. Time seemed to stand still in that small house. No one dared look anyone else in the eye. Julia sat alone on the edge of her bed, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She didn't cry out loud. She simply let the tears stream down her cheeks, her red eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, where family photos hung on the wall, reminding her of days of peace that could never return. Her mind was a whirlwind. Memories of evenings, whispering secrets with Sophie, promises to always be together, the absolute trust she'd placed in Ethan. All her dreams of a perfect home now crumbling beneath her feet like a sandcastle meeting the tide. Sophie climbed the stairs, her legs trembling, taking each slow step toward her sister's room. She paused at the door, about to knock, then pulled her hand back. At that moment, the door unexpectedly swung open. Julia stared at her, eyes red and swollen, but deep within was a cold composure Sophie had never seen before. Julia said nothing, just moved aside so Sophie could slip in silently. The bedroom was flooded with pale sunlight. Julia sat down on the bed, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails left marks in her pale skin. Sophie stood before her, lips trembling, her voice a whisper barely meant for two. "Julia, I'm sorry. I don't know how you could ever forgive me. I don't deserve it." Julia lifted her gaze, her eyes dry as if all the tears had finally run out. She stared at Sophie for a long, long time, as if searching for an explanation, a reason that could ease the pain. But the longer she looked, the more Sophie seemed like a stranger. Why did you do this, Sophie? You're my sister. I trusted you more than anyone. I always thought you'd be by my side." Julia's voice broke at the end, every word like a knife slicing deep into both their hearts. Sophie broke down in tears, collapsing at her sister's feet, clutching at Julia's hem, sobbing. "I'm sorry, please don't send me away, I'll do anything, just please, don't hate me." Julia pulled her hand away, covered her face, and wept. The sisters clung to each other on the bedroom floor, but between them was a gap that could never be bridged, a fracture no force on earth could heal. Downstairs, Ethan heard their crying drifting down, feeling as if thousands of needles pierced every muscle. He remembered the night before, Sophie's eyes when they both abandoned all reason. Even the sound of Julia's name echoing in his mind whenever he tried to stop but couldn't. Ethan no longer had the courage to face Julia, nor could he forgive himself. When Julia and Sophie came downstairs, Ethan was still there, his face weary, eyes sunken from a sleepless night. No one spoke. Julia sat across from Ethan, Sophie stood behind, hands gripping the back of the chair, shaking. The silence stretched, heavy as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Finally, Julia broke it, her voice hoarse. "What are we supposed to do now? The wedding? The family? Is this all a lifetime comes down to?" She let out a bitter laugh, and tears streamed down her face again. Ethan couldn't meet her eyes, only bowed his head, forcing out words. "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can say to justify what I've done. I know I've ruined everything." Julia looked up, fixing Ethan with a long, searching stare. "Who do you love, Ethan? Me or Sophie?" The question echoed through the deathly stillness, dissolving every lie, every excuse. Ethan hesitated, lips trembling. He wanted to say he loved Julia, wanted to be forgiven, but in his eyes was something he could not deny. A part of his heart had lost its way, no longer belonging to the woman in front of him. Sophie looked at Ethan too, her gaze pleading, in pain, holding both hope and despair. She wanted him to say it was just a reckless moment, wanted him to deny everything, but deep down, she feared she would be shattered if he admitted the truth of his feelings for her sister. The air between the three of them grew thick with words unsaid, secrets exposed, sweet memories now turned into burdens pressing down on each of them. Julia rose and walked out to the backyard, leaving Ethan and Sophie alone, the space between them full of questions no one dared answer. Ethan moved toward Sophie, hand lightly touching her shoulder, but Sophie pulled away, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never should have. I ruined everything." Ethan tried to say something, but his throat was tight. He looked at Sophie, seeing the pain in her eyes, not only the agony of forbidden love, but the guilt toward family and toward her own conscience. Outside, Julia stood silently under the porch, watching the last misty drops of rain fall on the grass. She didn't cry anymore, just counted her heartbeats, her breaths, as if wondering what to do next, what to keep believing in after all that had happened. No one could comfort her now, no embrace could shield her torn heart from those she loved most. Each of them sank into their own world, carrying regret, remorse, and a question with no answer. If they could turn back time, would they have had the strength to stop, or would they still slide helplessly down the slope of passion and guilt? The sky slowly cleared, but inside that house, the real storm had never truly ended. No one said another word throughout that gloomy afternoon. Julia remained quietly in the garden, her gaze fixed on the emptiness ahead, the light wind lifting strands of her hair that she didn't bother to push back. Inside, Sophie sat slumped on the living room floor, her head resting against the couch, her eyes swollen and red from too many tears. She didn't have the courage to go upstairs, couldn't face their mother, and couldn't even look at her sister whenever Julia passed by the window. Ethan stood leaning against the door. The occasional breeze slipping through the cracks did nothing to chase away the cold that had sunk deep into his soul. His mind was a tangled mess, wanting to hold Sophie, wanting to beg Julia for forgiveness, but all efforts now seemed meaningless, as the truth was too clear, too raw. The wedding never happened. That afternoon, Julia sent a message announcing the postponement of the wedding to friends and family, offering no explanation except health reasons. When their mother returned, the heavy atmosphere in the house told her everything. She sat down beside Julia, wrapping her eldest daughter in her arms. Julia rested her head on her mother's shoulder, didn't cry, didn't say a word, just held on tightly as if it was the last thing keeping her from falling into the abyss. Their mother glanced at Sophie with a look that was both suspicious and disappointed, but no one was brave enough to speak the truth out loud. The whole family ate dinner in silence. Julia barely touched her food, Sophie ate without tasting anything, and Ethan only pushed his meal around the plate. Each was lost in their own world, nursing pain that could not be shared. The once warm air of the house had frozen over with words left unspoken, questions never answered, and a bitter truth that could never be erased. After dinner, Julia went to her room, closing the door and leaving only a thin strip of light at the base. Sophie sat on the stairs, arms wrapped around her knees, tears once again streaming down her face. Ethan stood quietly on the porch, breathing in the air thick with the smell of wet grass and tears, his heart overcome with a helplessness he had never known before. In that brief moment, he wanted to disappear from this place, from every memory, from every judging glance, and even from himself. When night fell again, Sophie knocked on her sister's door, her voice hoarse. "Julia, I'm sorry. I know no words can ever be enough for you to forgive me, but I can't go on living without saying this one last time. I love you, and I'm sorry." Julia did not open the door. She only sat in darkness, listening to her sister's confession, her heart twisting, tears soaking her pillow. She didn't know whether to forgive, to hold onto her pride, or to let everything go in order to find peace. But in that moment, Julia felt smaller and more alone than she ever had, even as she sat in the house that once was home to all three of them. That night, Ethan packed his bags. He wrote Julia a letter and left it on the living room table. In it, he apologized for all the pain he had caused, promised to leave and never disrupt the sisters' lives again. He said there was nothing he could say to justify what he'd done, that he was willing to accept any punishment, only asking that Julia find it in her heart to forgive Sophie, just once. When he left the house, rain began to fall again, a gentle but persistent shower, as if the sky was mourning the collapse of a family. The next morning, Julia came downstairs and saw that Sophie had packed her things and was ready to leave. The two sisters stood across from each other on the porch, only a few steps apart but worlds away in their hearts. Sophie choked back tears. "I'm going. When you're ready to forgive me, I'll come back. If not, then just pretend I never existed." Julia didn't answer, only hugged her sister for a moment and then let go, her eyes dry but her voice shaking. "Go. Don't come back until you're strong enough to face the truth." Sophie left the house, her small suitcase rolling over the gravel path, her figure slowly swallowed up by the trees. Julia watched her go, the feeling of loss rising like a tide, overwhelming all her pain. She stood alone for a long time, until their mother came out and put an arm around her shoulders, quietly sharing a grief too deep for words. Ethan left town that very morning, leaving every memory behind, hoping those he had hurt might one day find peace. He knew he no longer deserved any love, nor was he strong enough to begin again here. The only things left in his heart were longing, regret, and the images of two women he had loved in all the wrong ways. Each went their separate ways, carrying pain and remorse that would not fade. Julia stayed with her mother, trying to mend the cracks in her heart, learning to live with the absence of both her sister and the man who had once meant the world to her. Sophie started a new life in a distant city, living day and night with regret, guilt, and a deep longing for the old home, her sister, and the forbidden love that had burned her soul. Ethan moved quietly through new cities, seeking forgiveness from himself, lying awake each night with dreams of that small house in the rain, where once a fleeting happiness had existed. Wounds might heal, but scars remain forever, etched into the memories of all three. A lasting reminder that the cost of one reckless night is sometimes not just momentary suffering, but loss that lingers for a lifetime. Time slipped by quietly, as if all the pain was gradually fading with the last rainy days of the season. Julia slowed her life down in the house full of memories. Every morning, she woke to the sound of birds singing through the window, made herself a cup of tea, and tried to smile at her mother, though her eyes still carried a lingering sadness. She practiced letting go of old habits, putting away the wedding photo that had never been hung, tucking the white dress deep into the farthest corner of the closet, clearing out all traces of the days leading up to a wedding that would never come. Some evenings, Julia sat alone on the steps, watching the night settle over the small garden, listening to the wind in the branches, and in her heart, the ache of missing her sister. Someone she both loved and hated in equal measure would return. Sometimes, Julia cried for all the sweet memories that had turned to pain, but there were also moments when she silently thanked fate, because through this tragedy, she finally understood the true value of family, of trust, and of forgiveness. In a distant city, Sophie began her new life, quietly and humbly. Every day at work, she forced herself to smile with colleagues, performed her tasks diligently, yet inside her heart was an emptiness she couldn't fill. At night, Sophie often sat by the window of her tiny rented room, watching the blinking lights of high-rises, listening to the rain on the tin roof, and wondering if Julia was already asleep back home, if their mother was still awake waiting for a message from her youngest daughter. Every time she thought of the old house, of the familiar porch, Sophie's heart twisted painfully. There were nights when she quietly opened her phone, typed the words, "Julia, I miss you," then deleted them because she didn't have the courage to send. Ethan chose to leave everything behind, moving to a small town by the sea, starting again in the solitude of someone carrying a wound without a name. He worked in a boatyard, facing the salty ocean wind day after day, his hands growing rough and calloused, his heart slowly quieting after all the turmoil. Sometimes, Ethan walked alone on the empty beach, remembering Sophie's brown hair, Julia's radiant smile, and wondered if he'd been braver, more decisive, whether everything could have been different. But then he understood. Some mistakes must be paid for with a lifetime, and real maturity means standing up from collapse, knowing how to forgive yourself after accepting every punishment. The first letters Sophie sent home, Julia tucked away in a drawer, never reading them but never throwing them out. Every shaky line, every apology, every little story from her new city felt like both a knife and a healing balm. One day, as rain drenched the path to the house, Julia decided to open all her sister's letters, reading every word, letting the tears fall without restraint. She realized that no matter how deeply love is wounded, family is the one thing that remains when everything else is gone. Months later, Sophie returned home one late afternoon, the sky ablaze with golden sunshine after rain. She stood for a long time in front of the gate, her heart pounding as if she were coming home for the very first time after so many years away. Julia opened the door, standing silently and looking at her sister from afar, her eyes filled with oceans of love and heartbreak. The two sisters stood quietly for a long while, until Sophie broke down, running into Julia's arms, and they held each other tightly on the porch, as if all the storms had finally been left behind. No words of forgiveness were spoken. There was only warmth, tears, and a love that had been tested, shattered, and healed in its own way. Ethan never returned to the town, but one afternoon, he received a small package from Sophie. Just a single photograph of the two sisters on the old porch, summer flowers blazing in the garden behind them. Ethan set the photo on his desk, gazed at it for a long time, and smiled, knowing that he would go on living, treasuring all the memories, beautiful and painful alike, as an inseparable part of his life. Life continued, each person walking their own path, carrying old scars and new hope. Julia grew stronger, Sophie more mature, and Ethan learned to love and forgive himself. The little house on the street was still filled with sunlight and the scent of morning tea. A place where three people once lost and suffering had finally found the way back to their own hearts. Some secrets will never be forgotten, some wounds never fully heal. But at the edge of every ruin, when one dares to face and forgive, the light of a new life begins to gently, persistently shine, like the last rays of sunlight lingering after the season's first rain.